The night in the American South is a living thing, heavy with the smell of magnolia and the faint hum of insects. Silence dominates, broken only by the creak of wood in an abandoned corridor, a whisper of wind slipping through cracked shutters. Behind the wealth, behind the charm, behind every carefully written letter of honor, hid something monstrous. Portraits of proud men and women stare down from walls that have seen horrors they never recorded. These weren't just men of property. They were men of power, power that turned them into something darker. Abusers, manipulators, destroyers of human souls. This is the story they never wanted you to hear, the untold abuse of power hidden in the lives of white masters. In the 1700s and 1800s, southern plantations glittered in the sun, a symbol of wealth, refinement, and the illusion of civility. White masters portrayed themselves as gentlemen of discipline and decorum, men of honor and refinement. They wore tailored coats, polished their boots, and quoted scripture, even as they condemned thousands to inhuman lives. Beneath the facade, however, lay an empire built on chains, violence, and psychological manipulation. Mansions gleamed with opulence while behind shuttered windows and locked doors, fear was cultivated, obedience enforced, and the human spirit systematically crushed. What did these so-called gentlemen do when no one was watching? Slavery was never just about labor. It was about absolute domination. Every law and custom codified the ownership of black bodies, granting white masters full control over lives, emotions, and futures. Overseers patrolled the fields with whips, while household slaves lived under constant surveillance, their every action scrutinized, every word measured. Slave codes gave masters unchecked authority to punish, imprison, or sell without trial. Ownership became psychological, a belief that controlling land naturally extended to controlling the human spirit. When a man is told he owns another human being, how long before he begins believing he owns their soul? And when this belief takes root, the line between discipline and cruelty dissolves entirely. Within the plantation house, the performance of power took on new dimensions. The domestic quarters were stages for the darkest acts of domination. Maids, nannies, cooks, and personal attendants were forced to navigate a world where obedience wasn't just required, it was survival. Masters' moods ruled the air. Sudden anger, jealousy, or boredom could transform a simple misstep into punishment, humiliation, or terror. Guests dined while enslaved women were made to serve, not just food, but shame, a cruel display of absolute control. Every room had rules. Every rule was meant to remind them, you are not free. Letters from enslaved narrators speak of a house where eyes never slept, a place where even brief moments of peace were impossible. Every shadow a reminder of constant scrutiny. Power did not stop at mere control. Masters exercised psychological domination with an obsession that blurred into cruelty. Alternating false kindness with unprovoked punishment, they ensured that the enslaved never knew stability or safety. Relationships were forbidden, friendships closely monitored, defiance punished with severity. Public beatings and forced labor became ritualized demonstrations of dominance. Many masters justified their actions through twisted logic, claiming that control was ordained by God, that obedience reinforced the natural order. Power didn't just corrupt them, it consumed them, until cruelty felt like a right and mercy became weakness. But power always leaves a trail. What did their victims leave behind to tell us the truth? Life for the enslaved was terror incarnate. Every sound, a creaking door, the snap of a whip, the boots of a master on the porch, could mean loss, separation, or death. They learned to hide emotions, to speak only when spoken to survive through silence and compliance. Testimonies collected during the 1930s WPA interviews reveal trembling voices recounting decades-old fear. We didn't sleep, we waited, some said, recounting nights spent anticipating punishment that could come at any hour. This constant vigilance shaped every movement, every glance, every word, molding lives into a survival calculus of obedience and fear. Unchecked power changes the holder as much as the victim. Masters, historians note, became addicted to control, deriving pleasure from manipulation, punishment, and the assertion of dominance. Their identity as lords of sprawling estates was inseparable from the suffering of those they owned. In many cases, cruelty became a daily ritual expected, normalized, and celebrated. They weren't just masters of land. They became slaves to their own power. What happens to a society when cruelty becomes part of its identity? Even in the shadows of secrecy, fragments of truth survived. Diaries, letters, court documents, and oral histories preserved glimpses of the reality that masters hoped would remain hidden. Some masters confessed to their own moral collapse, speaking in private of demons they could not escape. Enslaved people passed experiences down through coded songs, prayers, and stories, ensuring that memory outlived the empires built on oppression. The walls could not speak, but the survivors did, through whispers that transcended time, keeping the truth alive. After slavery ended, white society attempted to rewrite the past, sanitizing horrors and replacing them with comforting myths. The kind master became a legend, a story to soothe guilt, to mask the rot that had existed behind polished doors and polite society. Textbooks described plantations as orderly, even elegant. Films portrayed the South as genteel, glossing over the psychological and sexual terror suffered by the enslaved. But history cannot be contained by propaganda. The lies persisted only so long as those who lived the truth remained silent. Generations of enslaved descendants carried the weight of what had been hidden, passed down not through textbooks, but through whispered stories, songs, prayers, and the shadow of trauma that stretched across lifetimes. Even today, the echoes of those concealed crimes ripple through culture. Communities wrestle with inherited trauma, with the knowledge that comfort and wealth were built on brutality. Scholars and historians fight against centuries of obfuscation, digging through archives, letters, and diaries to recover the voices that power tried to erase. Museums and universities present raw, unfiltered narratives, forcing society to confront a reality that is as uncomfortable as it is essential. Every story reclaimed becomes a small act of justice, a reclamation of dignity for those whose suffering had long been ignored. For generations, people preferred lies over truth because truth was too filthy, too shameful, too real. Yet even now, the question lingers. How much of this history remains buried in private family archives, too shameful to reveal? To understand why these abuses were so pervasive, one must examine the psychology of absolute power. When individuals are conditioned to believe they own other human beings, morality becomes fluid and cruelty routine. Sociologists call this the pathology of dominance, a condition in which control itself becomes addictive, where punishing and manipulating others fuels self-importance and entitlement. Patriarchy and racial hierarchy normalized abuse, teaching even benevolent masters that cruelty was a right, and that human suffering was incidental to the maintenance of order. Ordinary men became monsters, not because they were inherently evil, but because a system rewarded the dehumanization of others. The most disturbing part of this story is not the violence itself. It is how ordinary it became, how deeply it penetrated the culture of a society that prided itself on civility. Restoring these hidden truths is more than historical reconstruction. It is an act of moral reckoning. Today, descendants of the enslaved reclaim their ancestors' voices, reading letters, preserving oral histories, and confronting monuments to wealth built on oppression. Museums host exhibitions that refuse to shy away from the filth, the cruelty, and the abuses once hidden behind plantation doors. Old photographs dissolve into modern faces, and the survivors' stories, once silenced, reclaim their rightful place in the narrative. For every story erased, a new truth rises. For every silence, a name returns. Remembering these lives is not only a tribute, it is justice. The plantations themselves, silent under the twilight sky, bear witness to the past. Wind stirs broken shutters. Empty fields stretch where bodies once toiled. Ruins of grand houses stand as monuments to a world that believed itself above morality. They built kingdoms on bodies, convinced power would shield them from consequences. Yet history remains the ultimate master, and power cannot outrun its reckoning. The abuse of power did not end with them. It echoes through generations, through trauma, through memory. To ignore it is to perpetuate its legacy. To face it is to honor the resilience of those who survived. Every brick, every beam, every corridor carries a story of terror and survival. The walls may not speak aloud, but they remember. And so must we, because the truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again. And when we bear witness to the full measure of human cruelty and resilience, we confront not just history, but the present, the lives still shadowed by injustice, the voices still struggling to be heard. Only by facing these hidden truths can society begin to understand the depths of its past, and perhaps take the first steps toward true reckoning and reconciliation. The past is not gone. It breathes through every untold story, every silent scream, every hidden truth that has endured centuries. And now that you know, the question remains, what will you do with this truth?